chapter. Now we get to just add our decimals. So last week we drew some pictures. One day you drew some models, and then the other day you did some shading. So you shaded in some of the 100 grids to make holes and add the holes with the partials, with the partial decimal products. So now we're going to kind of use what you learned those days, and we're just going to add up some of these decimals. So this is just another tool for you. So I want you to look at this problem of the day. Hold on one second. If you have a whiteboard, I want you to look at your whiteboard, and you can do this on your whiteboard. If you do not have a whiteboard, too much movement. I'll wait till you're done. I want to make sure you understand this question and you hear what to do. If you don't have a whiteboard, then I want you to use your notebook, and I just want you can just make a little square somewhere and do problem of the day there. Here's the question. The numbers below are missing their decimal points. Put the decimal point in the numbers so that the numbers are ordered from least to greatest. So starting from over here on this side, this will be the least to the greatest. So where would you put the decimal points in order to make that true? Okay, so think about it. Each number is going to have one decimal point added to it, and you can put it wherever you want, but it has to be in order from least to greatest. Okay, try it. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Look over at your notebook. Write that into your notebook, please. All right, so in your notes, you need to make sure you have the chapter, which is chapter 5, lesson 6, and then write the title of adding decimals. Here are two things that you need to remember when you add decimals. So I want you to write these two things down. The first thing is that you line up your decimals. So you're going to line up the decimal points whenever you add or subtract. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. Sorry, I ran out of space there. So notice that I didn't put when you multiply or divide, because that has different rules. So in this chapter, we're only talking about adding and subtracting our decimals. So we're going to make sure that we're always lining up the decimal points. And I have a little trick for you once we get started with some examples so that you never forget to do that. Because if you forget to do that, you'll get a different answer sometimes. Second thing is to add each place starting at the right, just like a regular addition problem. Okay? So normally, whenever you have numbers that you're adding up, you would start in the ones place, right? If you had whole numbers, like what you remember to do a long time ago, add up two whole numbers, you would start all the way to the right, and that would be the ones place, and you'd add up the ones, then the tens, then the hundreds, then the thousands, all that. When we're working with decimals, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to start all the way to the right, although that's not going to be the ones place, and it's not always going to be the tenths place or the hundredths place. It's whatever place you're starting at. Okay, whatever place is all the way to the right is the place where you start. So it's almost like we're going to, once we get the numbers set up the right way, lining up our points, it's almost like we're going to forget that there's even a decimal there, and we're just going to add. Same thing when we subtract too. You're going to subtract just like as if there were no decimal point. That actually isn't too bad when you're adding or subtracting. It's when you're multiplying that it turns into something different. So everybody get these two things?
No. Yes.
Okay, I'll give you another second to copy these, and then we have to do some examples. The first example that I'm going to do, I want you to make sure that I'm going to show you as if we were modeling it like what you did last week, just to show you what you did last week on lessons 4 and 5, how that kind of transfers over to lesson 6, which is what we're doing today. So here's your first example. If we have 9/10, actually before we write that, here was my trick to show you. If you start out every problem like this, decimal, start out every problem like this. Decimal, decimal, line, decimal. And in this first, we're going to be adding. So I'm going to put an addition sign over here. So what I've done is put in all of my decimal points at the very beginning. That way I don't mess up and not line them up. So remember the rule number 1 that I told you was to always line up your decimal points whenever you're adding or subtracting decimals. So I put my first decimal up there at the top. Yeah, try that again. Having a hard time today. It's already done it a couple times. All right, so up here, that's our first number, our second number, and our answer. So we're going to add 9/10 with 7/10. Notice how I just wrote the number in around my points like that. That's what I want you to do today for your work. So you're going to start every problem with decimal, decimal, line, decimal, and then you're going to just fill in all the numbers around. So when you're adding and subtracting, your decimal points actually just falls right down into the answer. Okay, so your decimal point just goes straight down into the answer. When you're multiplying or when you're dividing, there are different rules. So like I said before, we're going to work on just adding and subtracting in this chapter. But just know that in the future, once we start the next chapter and talking about multiplying and dividing, the rules are a little bit different. But for this one, decimal points are all in a line. Okay? So 9/10 would look like this. That's 9/10. Please just write this one we're going to draw, and the rest we're not. And then 7/10 looks like this. I did them like in rows, in a row of 5. So if I'm adding 9/10 with 7/10, and the tenths are like the longs, you know, that's how I'm using them like the longs. Then I'm going to take these ones, and that makes a whole. And a whole was like this. Because I took 10/10, which makes a whole. And then I have 4 plus 2 more is 6. 6 more tenths. So my picture, based on my picture, my answer should be 1 and 6/10. 1 and 6/10. So let's see if that's what we get in our answer. You don't have to draw the picture for every question. I wanted to draw the picture to show you how that correlates with what you've learned already. Okay? So all I'm going to do is start all the way to the right, and I'm going to add 9 plus 7, which is 16. Just like whenever you add up on a regular number, like if there were no decimal points, you would add 9 and 7, you'd carry the 1, put the 6 underneath, and 1 plus 0 is 1. So then my final answer is 1 and 6/10. So you're going to carry the zero, not the zero. You're going to carry the first digit every time up into the next column, just like you would when you're whenever you're working on a regular problem without a decimal point. So a whole number would be the same thing. So what we did when we carried that 1 over, this is why we carried the 1 over, because I took all these tenths and I made them into a 1 whole. That's what we did when we carried the 1, just so that you realize that goes together. Vicki, go ahead and sharpen your pencil. Thank you for waiting. Okay, let's do another example, this time without a picture. 4 and 88/100 plus 8 and 19/100. So I'm going to start off with decimal, decimal, line, decimal. And I'm going to put an addition sign over here. Every question in all the problems we're doing today are all addition problems. But we will be working on subtraction soon. And then you're going to have a lesson where it's all mixed. And on your test, it'll be all mixed up. So some questions will be addition and some will be subtraction, and you have to pay really close attention to the sign. So just know, though, that today's lesson, they'll all be addition problems, because that's all we're doing today is adding. So now I'm going to fill in the numbers around my decimal points. So I have 4 and 88/100, 8 and 19/100, and now I'm going to add it up. Hopefully you're taking notes over here. Write down everything that I write. So I'm going to start all the way over to the right and add up 8 and 9, which gives me 17. So 1 over here, 7 underneath. 1 plus 8 is 10. So I put a 1 over here and a 0 underneath. See how I'm just kind of passing right over the decimal point? I'm just pretending like it's not there. Once you've drawn your decimal line, decimal, you don't have to, then you kind of just can forget that there's a decimal there at all because you're just working right over it. Now 1 plus 4 plus 8, I know that 1 and 4 is 5, and then 5 plus 8 is 13. So my answer is 13 and 7/100. Now you may be thinking, why is it so important to put the decimal line, decimal? Because so far the first two examples that we've done have matched up, meaning the first ones, both numbers went to the tenths place. The second example, both numbers went to the hundredths place. But what happens if I have a number like this? Here's my question. 14 and 5/100 plus 9 and 2/10. So now what would happen if I didn't line up my decimal points? Look what would happen if I didn't line them up. See what would happen?
Yeah.
I'm going to start adding up digits that aren't in the same place, right? So the whole thing when you're adding or subtracting is that you have to, when you're adding hundredths together. You're adding tenths together. You're adding ones together. So you're not like this. I would be adding hundredths, which is this number, with the tenths. So you can't do this. You'd get the wrong answer if you did this, right?
Yeah.
So the whole thing is that you need to start out with the decimal line, decimal. That way you never make that mistake. So start out like this every time. And we're adding, and then you write the number in around it. And then we end up with that. Do you see the difference? Now I'm adding tenths with tenths, and hundredths with hundredths, and ones with ones.
Are you writing that?
You are. This is your third example for your notes. So anybody remember that word that we used before? And we did this when we compared decimals. So the last time we worked with decimals, we were comparing and ordering them. And sometimes we would have an empty space like this. And there's something, a word, let's see if anybody remembers it, that when you add a 0 into the spot, do you remember what it's called? Annex. So we're going to annex a 0 right here. I want you to write that in your notes. Here's why we annexed a 0. Basically, it's just a placeholder. It doesn't change the value of the number, right? We know that 9 and 2/10 is the same as 9 and 20/100 because that 0, we don't really need it there, but the reason why it's there is to hold the place. So now when we're adding, we're not adding 5 with a nothing. We're adding 5 with a 0, which is a number, right? So 5 with nothing kind of makes it confusing. So instead, we annex a 0 there before we do our adding. So what that means, like when you were drawing a picture, it would just mean that there were no hundredths in that picture. Okay? No hundredths for that number. Hamza. You could put another 0 if you wanted to right here in front of the 9. That you can annex another 0 there if you wanted to. It just kind of helps when you're adding that you don't have any blank spots. So now we're going to add 5 plus 0 because remember you always start all the way to the right, which would give you 5. 0 and 2 is 2. 4 and 9 is 13. Carry the 1 and put the 3 under here. Then 1 plus 0 is just 2. So you get 23 and 25/100. Get that one? I'm going to give you another one that I want you to try on your own, okay? Without me helping you. I'm going to give you a second to do it on your own. So let's do 123 and 8/10 plus 12 and 38/100. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to try this one. Don't talk to your neighbor yet. I'll let you ask your neighbor when you're all finished. Look, so this question is kind of like that other one I gave you. If you forget to line up your decimal points, you're going to get a different answer. So remember, the first thing you should do on these is setting up your problem just like this, and then we'll write in the numbers around. That way we don't forget to match them out, match up the same place value. We can annex a 0 in that spot right there, and then we can start adding. So 0 plus 8 is 8. 8 plus 3 is 11. 1 plus 3 plus 2 is 6. Boys, turn around and look at the screen. Thank you. 2 plus 1 is 3, and then 1 you would just bring down just like that. So your answer should be 136 and 1800ths. Okay, let's look at your example page.
Really already?
Yep.
Yeah.
So here it is. I can't give you time to staple. You've had your time to staple. So if you need to still staple your papers, you'll have to wait until after I'm done talking. Then you can staple. We want to make sure we can get started on our assignment. Example number 1 says, Mr. Jacobson uses a digital scale to measure 44 2/10 milligrams of sodium for a chemistry experiment. During the second experiment, he used 33 1/10 milligrams of sodium. What's the total amount of sodium used? So we're going to add up the two numbers together. We're adding them. They've already written them here for you, but notice the 2 decimal points. So you've got 1 here, and 1 down there in the answer. So in the directions it says step number 1 is to line up your decimal points, and you'll do that if you remember my trick. Then you add the digits in the same place value positions. So by putting by lining up the decimal points, you put the numbers in order to where you're going to be lining up each decimal place together. Last thing is you bring down the decimal point straight down into the answer. So we're going to first add up the tenths, which is 2 plus 1 is 3. Add up the ones, which is 4 and 3, gives you 7. And again in the tens place, 4 and 3 would also give you 7. So the total amount of sodium used is 77 and 3/10 milligrams. If you estimated, which was the very beginning of the question, if we estimated at 40 and at 30, let's say we rounded to the nearest tens, our 40 plus 30 would be 70. 70 is close to 77 and 3/10. So what you learned at the beginning of this chapter when we did some rounding and estimating, that's what we did last week. It was one of the first lessons in this chapter. That will help you in just making sure and double checking your answers at the end here. So it's not something that you have to do for every single question, but you should do it on every few. So every few questions, just do a really quick estimate in your head, and then you make sure that your answer is reasonable. Yes?
The estimate want to be 70. It said estimate 44 plus 33.
So they rounded to the nearest ones. It doesn't matter. Estimates can be different things. 70 is still close to 77. But if you did 44 plus 33, if you rounded to the nearest ones, I was just rounding to the nearest tens. You could do either way. You're going to get something that's close. All right, look at the next example. It says example number 2 is find 19 and 6/10 plus 4 and 31/100. So you notice here that they annexed a 0. They added that extra 0 in just as a placeholder. So the first step is to line up the decimal points, annex a 0 so that both numbers end in the same place value. Then you add the digits in the same place value. So you get a 1 here, a 9 here in the tenths place. 9 and 4 is going to give you 13 in the ones, and then 1 plus 1 is 2 for the tens place. So if we estimated and we rounded those numbers up, 19 up to 20 and rounded 4 to 4 and 31/100 just to 4, you'd get 24 as your estimate. So our estimate 24 is reasonable to 23 and 91/100.
Real answer on the left and your
Estimate on the right. That's okay. That's fine. Usually what you're doing for your estimate anyways is it in your head, mostly. They just write it out just to make sure that you're doing it, but really you're doing it in your head. You should be thinking of what those numbers are in your head and then adding it up. Because remember, an estimate should be something that's easy mental math. Okay, thank you. All right, so for the guided practice questions, I want you to do these by yourself first, then double check them with a neighbor. Your directions for today do ask you to check for reasonableness. See, this is the beginning of your assignment. So when it says check for reasonableness, what that means, here's what I want you to do. Really what they're saying is make an estimate in your head of what those numbers would be and then add them together in your head. So maybe you're rounding 54 hundredths to up to 1, and then you're rounding 7 8/10 up to 8, and then you're going to add them together, and so your answer should be somewhere around 9. The other thing that you can do when you're checking for reasonableness is double check that you have that you have your decimals lined up and you've added up the correct place values. This question right here, they've left a blank spot. That's for you to annex a 0. See? So sometimes they write them horizontally and sometimes they write them vertically. So you have to look and see. Same thing though, right? We're doing the same thing. The only thing is on problems like this, they've already lined up the decimals for you. And when they write them vertically, horizontally, side to side, you have to remember to line up those decimal points. Okay? So once you finish your guided practice and you check it with a neighbor, you can start your independent practice.